Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian. I'll be the admin for the Zoom meeting this afternoon. At the end, depending on time, we'll have questions and answers. So if you want to put in the chat to me, the name is admin. So that should pop up for you in the chat function. So just let me know if you have a question or not. And we'll be starting here in just 1 minute. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the seminar. Today we have Terry Blackwell, Jr., BCBA, President and Chief Executive Officer of Chimes, and Jerry Cotter, Executive Vice President of Chimes, DC. They'll be presenting today, and I'm going to kick it off to Terry. Good afternoon, Terry.
Good afternoon, Brian. How are you?
Excellent.
Today's session, for those of you who are participating remotely out of state, will focus predominantly on the federal IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, as it relates to students who are transitioning from school into life after school. My position with the organization comes after many, many years in education, predominantly in the New York City, New York State area, and my qualifications are kind of as old as I am. I am a permanently licensed school principal in the state of New York. I hold a master's in education from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I'm a licensed and board certified behavior analyst and was an adjunct professor at Seton Hall University, teaching in their graduate school of psychology for about 6 years. And probably most important is I am also the parent of a young man who went through the IEP process. And so I will integrate some of my experience as a consumer of services and as somebody who has sat on the other side of the table going through an IEP with school districts seeking to negotiate benefits and program support services that were most advantageous to my own son. Next, Brian. So the purpose of today's session is to give you information that will help you review the process of students leaving school and entering life after school. That is something that's affectionately called transitioning. Transitioning is a term that's encompassing for really, if you think about it, a very, very big process. We spend between 12 to 15 years of life between first grade and graduation from high school, also known as secondary education. Unfortunately, we do very little in the way of being able to anticipate what comes after school. And we often find that the transition is really not working out well. Why? Because it's been inadequately prepared for. So today's session is to give you some information about what the IDEA provides for as a law at the federal level, where you can find that information and how you can use it. Next slide, Brian. So in the agenda of my presentation, which will be followed by Jerry Cotter, I'm going to speak to you about the experience of going through an IEP, affirm that an IEP is indeed a contract between yourselves as the stakeholders and the school district where your child is served. What is the IDEA and what are the requirements in law at the federal level, and where can you find the state implementation of that law? What are some of the resources that you might want to be aware of and use in planning for transition? I will touch very briefly on the AbilityOne law, which is a federal law implemented nationally. Also, the two brokers of that law, which are two nonprofits known as Source America and National Industries for the Blind. And finally, talk a little bit about life after education funding in your state. Next slide. So washing of hands, what is the experience as an educator, as a parent, as a student? when you graduate from high school if you are a child with an IEP. And I'll use those terms interchangeably because I know that we have people on the phone who are stakeholders. Everybody's a stakeholder. Some are parents, some are guardians, some are siblings, and some are also foster parents. Some are also district administrators trying to do the right things for kids in a system that's often very, very heavily burdened with very large caseloads. If you see this washing of hands or falling off of a cliff, when I've worked with parents over the past 25 to 30 years, I very often hear that phrase. What happened to my kid when they graduated from school? It was like they fell off a cliff. Well, a lot of that has to do with the funding that is available, and it's really not the blame of the school districts if your child is transitioning and there's no effective plan in place. The federal law requires that the school district disengage once a student has graduated. However, the piece that I'd like to focus more on is what the federal law requires for transition planning. If you read or take a look at the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, you will note within there that it talks about transition planning must occur in the IEP process beginning at the age of 14. Now, that's what the law says. It's my experience that many states don't fully engage in that until about the age of 16. I note that parents who have effectively transitioned their kids from special education typically start earlier, and that starts how and why and what. Well, it starts with asking questions early about, well, if your child has the cognitive capacity to engage in the discussion, what do they see as their career goals or life goals after school? One of the challenges in the design of school is secondary education and primary education. If you start having a conversation with your child in 7th or 8th grade, by the time they are going into high school, they're going to have an entirely different team. So there's very little continuity and the ability to carry over that work. So transition planning starting in early is a great idea. It's very often lost unless you happen to be lucky enough to have a case manager who can help you to transition between, let's say, 8th grade and 9th grade. I will typically see that junior high school in most regions in the New York City metro area begins at about 6th, 7th grade, but then again, there's a cutoff, and 10th grade, it's a whole new staff and a whole new group of people. If you think about it, the challenges with designing the next 50 to 60 years of someone's life and starting with only a year to a year and a half to plan is significant. And I would warn you, as it says at the bottom of this slide, the funding that you're going to find for students after education ends doesn't look anything like the funding that you're used to. When you fall off that cliff, very often to access any kind of adult services, there are waiting lists between 5 to 10 years in different states. And those are just the states that I'm aware of along the eastern seaboard of the US. Unfortunately, there was a change that went on during the second Bush administration with the introduction of a program called No Child Left Behind. And this gave rise to a couple of things that I think were not helpful to many, many students, one of which was the comment of teach to the test. The movement in education became for districts to basically make sure that their scores on testing were as high as they could possibly get. And very often children who were in vocational technical high schools would score lower than the academic groups. And that in turn drove funding for the districts. So I recall having a meeting in New York City where I was speaking about, with the district superintendent, I was speaking about vocational technical high schools and was stunned to find out that there was only one remaining VOTech high school in the city of New York, because all of the other VOTech high schools, vocational technical high schools, had been converted so that they could get their scores up and access further additional funding. Next slide, Brian. So where can you find this law that really is what drives the funding and the IEP that you're sitting down to? A good site is the government site listed as the top link. Basically, it has colloquial language embedded around the IDEA because at the end of the day, it is a law and it's written in a way that's difficult to understand. But for those of you who would like to actually read the detail of the law itself, and I've pulled a couple of pieces of it out here as it regards transitioning, this second link, also a federal government site, has the actual PDF of the law, inclusive of all the amendments that have been made since it last passed. There are many other resources available, and I would suggest Wright's Law, WRIGTS-LAW. It has been a very, very useful source of information for me, written in generic language so it's understandable. Next slide. So going into the IEP meeting, what are your options? Now, I recall going into an IEP myself one time and having a social worker explain to me that my child was uneducable. And that was a very difficult meeting. And I look back on that meeting and I don't believe the individual meant to be malicious. I just simply think that they were ignorant. And yet along the way, we also ran into real heroes who were champions. One case manager by the name of Doug comes to mind, a vice principal of the vocational high school that we worked with, named Tom Mazzarelli, another hero. You'll find both types of people. At the same time, it's the obligation of the stakeholder / parent guardian to be up on what it is you're seeking when you walk into the IEP. I'll tell you, the parents who come prepared for asking specifically for what they want are going to have a very much improved outcome over parents who are simply hoping that the IEP team, has done the work for them. And that's just my own experience. I do believe that post high school, very often the recommendations are either very limited or oriented towards children who have higher functioning cognitive skills to go perhaps to specialty community college programs or even four-year programs. It's unusual in my experience that you'll walk into a meeting where employment is considered as an option. Certainly employment at a full-time level is a very rare thing. Employment that fades in, meaning perhaps your son or your daughter, your student, can only take a part-time job out of the gate and they need to develop work readiness skills and other skills. That's one of the options that we're here to talk to you about today through this presentation. It's my observation that as a country, we need to make a massive effort for graduates to be able to at least explore employment upon graduation. Too often I've worked, particularly in South Baltimore and in the South Bronx, with mothers, single working moms, who will call and express tremendous fear that their son or their daughter, usually their son, has graduated from high school, but that they have to work to support themselves. And they're terribly worried what's going to happen when I'm not home and they're sitting on a couch or they're out in the streets and they're going to associate with people to get them in trouble. I'll add as a last item here about transitioning while the student is still in school that many states do offer through typically something called vocational rehab services. A period of time, usually between 90 days to 6 months, where there can be an overlap. And you'll often hear from school district personnel, they have to be careful about double dipping on funding. Again, this is an area where in most states, and I'm going to pick on New York City because I'm familiar with it, there can be a double dip, or meaning two sources can be billed for the same student at the same time, because work readiness assessments, other things of that nature can be performed within the last 6 months of the student still being in school. And those become very, very helpful in terms of guiding employment particularly. Next slide. So the sections of the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act, that I pulled out and that you can find if you go to one of the links that was previously put up on the screen, is under Section 5, Subchapter 4. You'll read the following: Congress finds, and then it goes on, it talks about, in addressing the full range of needs of students, particularly the needs of children with disabilities that need significant levels of support to participate and learn in school and the community. And I emphasize that last piece because very often in an IEP, the only conversation that will take place with stakeholders and the IEP team is about academics. But if you read it carefully, and the community. So my interpretation that I note below this is that the district has an obligation to meet the full range. That's actually what the law says. The full range of students' needs, including participating in the community, therefore transitioning. Participating in the community implies that there will be activities going beyond the school doors to help your son, your daughter, your sister, your brother, whoever it is that your student that you're responsible for, transition successfully. There must be some effort at community integration. And I think the supported employment is the best way to do that. Next slide. So staying with the IDEA as law, in the same section, Section 5, it talks about ensuring the involvement of parents in planning and decision-making with respect to transitional services. Where it gets more curious to me, and I think where it has some teeth, is it talks further in Section C about achieving high quality, and transitional results, with emphasis on the word results for children with disabilities. In section D, that continues on and speaks to providing such parents information on their rights, the protections and responsibilities under this chapter to ensure transitional results for children with disabilities. I started this by introducing that I was a behavior analyst. The word results is important, and to ensure is also important. It implies that there is a measurement of success. So I do think that it's helpful for any parent that's going into an IEP meeting to ask some questions about what has been their district's experience, and if they have metrics with people who have been placed in beyond secondary education in both school, meaning perhaps college or community college, and employment. Find out what are those results. And if there are no metrics, that certainly is a point for you to continue to discuss with your district. Next slide, Brian. So I've listed a couple of sites that I think would be very useful as a parent, reflecting back on my time. The National Association of Secondary Education Providers, which is high school in non-education language, has assembled a very good transition toolkit for parents and professionals. That link is here. So if you are a member of an IEP team, a case manager, if you happen to be a parent, an advocate, take a look at this transition toolkit, because that in and of itself could be a whole in-service training. It's helpful. And I'll emphasize this, don't expect that the district has the time or the energy to be able to do the work for you as a stakeholder or an advocate. Again, proper preparation walking into that IEP as early as you can begin is going to have the best possible outcome for you on getting what you need for your child, son, daughter, brother, sister. The second link that I've placed in here has to do with how various states administer the IDEA. So if you recall, I said that the federal IDEA requires you to start transition planning at the age of 14. Well, different states may have different dates. Some states may say 16, some states may say 15. If you take a look at this particular site, you can go and see in your state how specifically the IDEA federal rule is administered state to state. Next slide, Brian. So kind of getting to the meat of our presentation, I have to tell us a short story. Back about a decade ago, I was working in New York City, and I happened to have an opportunity to meet with then Superintendent of Special Ed, Gary Hecht, at the New York City Department of Education. And he was a gentleman who had spent much of his professional career as a school principal at a high school for individuals who had emotional diagnoses, emotionally disturbed. And when we were talking, I asked him approximately how many student IEPs he had in his district every month or every day. And he said that he had at any given point in time 125,000 IEPs. That's enormous. And he believed that his district was probably the largest special ed district in the country. Perhaps Los Angeles or some other city came close. I began to talk to him about how was he effectively planning to transition. Let's say that a quarter of those children, or 30,000 some odd children, were graduating in that year. How was he transitioning them for life beyond school? And he talked about how he had worked very, very hard for much of his career, and that there were kids that he could recall that it was just tragic that after school there was nothing for them. And so I spoke to him about the program you see listed here on slide, the AbilityOne. AbilityOne is actually a set of federal laws that was approved under something called the Jacobs-Wagner-O'Day Act. And it came about at the end of the World War to help veterans who had been injured in battle or injured in theater and needed supported employment for the jobs that they could obtain when they came back. The two other words here, Source America and National Industries for the Blind, are two contracted nonprofit agencies, both of which serve in a brokerage function, to use that term loosely. AbilityOne has created jobs, you'll see it there, 40,000 full-time jobs across the country. That's as of today. And that may employ as many as 60 to 75,000 individuals, because full-time equivalent, many of those people in those jobs are part-time. We at Chimes International have engaged now for many years in what we call supported integrated employment. And that's employment that has supports for students with special needs, as well as persons who are disabled for the work, which is a specific legal term used within the Source America selection. After my presentation, Jerry Cotter, who is a retired colonel from the United States Army and an expert in federal acquisition regulation, is going to talk more specifically about the program and the opportunity for you to consider this in your planning purposes for transition in IEPs. If after you've heard this, you're excited about it, as I was when I first heard about it, please remember that right now, unfortunately, there are forces at work at the federal level seeking to dismantle this program, even though it employs 75,000 people with different needs. And if you find that as you continue down your path of IEP planning, this is a useful program, remember to reach out to your local congressman or senator and let them know that you support the program. Next slide, Brian. And finally, in summary, the employment programs that Chimes operates today across our footprint of 7 states employs something in the area of close to 1,000 individuals with special needs. I've heard this gentleman who's in the slide, who has worked for us for more than a decade, talk about how this has changed his life, given him a level of autonomy and independence he never dreamed of. And he's been promoted in his position, as have many of the individuals we work with. We believe that the AbilityOne program remains highly relevant to today's needs. And further, we believe that the program itself should be expanded, specifically for students who are transitioning from education into employment. For those who would seek to change the program, we have a very simple request, which is that they do their research, that they find out what are the life goals of the individuals currently participating, and are they met or not by the existing program. And rather than simply throwing a light switch and turning off a program that today is serving, let's call it 50,000 individuals with special needs and has served millions of people over the years, rather than just turning off the light switch, we ask that any changes to the program reflect research on what works best and peer-reviewed publication before those changes are implemented. And with that, I will conclude my slides and entertain any questions there might be.
Thank you, Terry. One of the questions that came in was from the professionals from school districts. Where can they search for information about how to connect with the AbilityOne program?
That's a great question, and hopefully I can offer some assistance. I think it's probably important, if you're a school district member of an IEP or a school district administrator, to take a look at the AbilityOne site. It'll actually tell you about the law behind the program and what the program is made for. And then there are organizations that'll be specific. If you're dealing with somebody with a visual impairment, you'll want to go to the National Industries for the Blind. If you're dealing with somebody, let's say, who has autism with significant behavioral issues, you would want to look at Source America, again, the agency that brokers out the contracts for employment, and see who in your neighborhood is a Source America nonprofit, meaning a vendor. Chimes happens to be one. There are nearly 500 across the country. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there would be an immediate job, but if you were, for example, to reach out in New York to FedCap, you might be able to say, hey, look, my son or daughter is graduating. I see that you guys do the Statue of Liberty for janitorial maintenance and groundskeeping. My kid loves doing fill in the blank. And those are the connections that I think are going to be most relevant, are connections at the local level with the nonprofits that support the AbilityOne program. Any other question, Brian?
There's a lot of comments. Powerful question with the one about having results in the school district and providing post-high school support. They're saying, make sure to check their track record on what they've done previously. Another question that came in was the AbilityOne program. They had not heard of this program before. Is it in every district? And if it's not, how can they work to get that done?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's fair to say that AbilityOne is in every district. I think you have to take it city by city. Certainly more rural areas might not have opportunities for employment for persons with disability under the AbilityOne program. Our current contracts at Chimes are very much integrated with the General Services Administration, with the Department of Defense. And I'll just give you an example of some of the contracts where we operate. Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, the Pentagon. There are also, and I think it's important to mention this, each state has its own set aside work program. So in Maryland, the name of that organization happens to be Maryland Works, and Chimes has a workforce out there of almost 200 people with disabilities. And that was the #1 rated airport in the country for its size in the year 2021. In New York State, there's New York State Industries for the Disabled, which is a very, very large program. I think almost $300 million of operating budget per year. So the concept of quote unquote set aside work exists at the federal level through AbilityOne and also in each of the states.
Excellent. And I don't know if you have the answer to this one or not, Terry. Are the programs applicable for students who are over 18 or undocumented?
Yeah, I would assume, I'm going to say that the programs are available for students who are over 18. I suspect probably on a part-time basis if the student is still in school, just like any other, when I was a kid in high school working in the supermarket. The question relative to undocumented, I really don't know. I suspect that many of the facilities that have contracts, for example, the Pentagon, Fort Bragg, require documentation simply for security clearances.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to try to keep us on time schedule. Keep your questions coming in, and if we have time at the end, we'll get those. And I'm going to pass it on over to Jerry.
Thank you.
All right, I think you can hear me now.
Yeah.
So again, Jerry Cotter, and I manage the employment division of Chimes DC. And we were just grabbing state names, so that's how I got DC. So what we do is we're basically a federal contractor, and there's a procurement program that provides set aside in both the state and the federal level that companies like Chimes, and again, as Terry mentioned, across the nation, there's about 500 to 600 agencies providing various level of behaviors, but we compete for contracts on the federal level or the state level, and then we execute those contracts employing people with disabilities. So that's an operating principle. It's something that we need to attain to be able to hold on to work and to perform the work. So as part of that's the driving factor of the program. Next slide, please. So again, the point today is to provide information to assist in locating the employment opportunities in your area, and then to help to give you some information that allows you to work with the employment opportunities and facilitate a conversation for your family members. Next slide, please. So the general areas that I'm going to walk through is just what do we face in a disability employment environment, how we see the environment constructed, and we described as an ecosystem, and things are related and supporting, where the employment programs are, just a little bit of a snapshot of Chimes DC, our employment services operation. And so you can see the kind of the map of what we do on a regular basis. And then just to close out that we do intend to continue this program and to provide additional reports on topics that we believe are useful for the community. And hopefully with your input, we can sharpen that pencil even further. Next slide, please. So it's well documented that across the nation, individuals with disabilities have a much higher unemployment rate than the general population. And the point of noting that is that programs like this, and I think there was a comment earlier about not having not heard about the program. This is one of the ways to address that lack of information and that employment rate. And we strive to not only fill the positions that we currently have, but also then to look at new ways and innovative ways to increase the portfolio of employment and to address all of that in a supported, integrated environment. Next slide, please. So, as we just mapped out the relationship, which noting here, everyone from different offices and that are related. We have the family, we have high schools and state offices that provide governance and execution. You also have community service providers. So one of the other divisions of Chimes, we have 3 different community service providers, one in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. And we also have a behavioral health unit in Pennsylvania. So we're interacting with a lot of different families throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. And then underneath that, you have the federal and state procurement programs. And these are documented programs that are priorities for procurement. And federal buyers or state buyers are required to look at providing employment opportunities via these programs when they look to buy and to purchase for their state or federal needs. And then you have a network of employers. You have the direct network of nonprofits that employ underneath the authority of these programs. But it's not lost on us that there's also many private sector employers that are the employer of record for individuals with disabilities. So it's everyone working together and to try to exchange information and to provide the most viable outcomes for the individuals we serve. And what we see that is that these jobs here are meaningful, they're stepping stones to future employment, and that we view the employment as treatment, and it's helping to develop skills that individuals can carry forward to a greater extent in their lives. Next slide, please. So as Terry mentioned, the federal program is called AbilityOne. It's authorized by federal statute. And underneath that, there's 2 agencies, one that brokers opportunities that are primarily offered to individuals with more severe disability, and then one that is offered for individuals that have blind or vision impairment. And you have those 2 separate administrating agencies, and then they will interact with the broader network of companies that are the employers and that have the responsibility for either producing a product or producing a service and utilizing individuals with disabilities to achieve those outcomes. As well as in the states, there is the State Use Program Association, and that is the association of state agencies that administer a very similar program, but at the state's level. So Terry mentioned, we operate the custodial contract at BWI Airport in Maryland. That is a state contract, and we hold the contract and we employ individuals in our regional area in the Baltimore, Washington metro area on that contract. Next slide, please. So as we continue the series, and I'll go a little bit more into the mechanics of the programs, one of the things that we've got ongoing and we see as an area for integration and as part of this presentation is to try to better align what we currently have in our portfolio with education, and to have that conversation with the education systems and to target students. And then also we're communicating already with the community service providers, but to basically say, if you have students that are looking for employment and we have positions in your neighborhood, how do we make that connection so that we can facilitate either job exploration or a full-time position or a part-time position on a regular basis? And then also to work with the customers, because the customers have accepted that the work is going to be performed by people with disabilities. That's the authority that allows them to purchase with the nonprofit network. So they recognize that individuals with disabilities will be working there. And then we can go back and again, continue that collaboration with them to say, how do we either use on a short term or a longer term and build that connection with the education system so that students can also be exposed to the employment either on a temporary or a long-term basis. And the other question is, we'll have a slide reference the portfolio and the type of jobs that are currently there. But the next would be, what else can we do? If you have curriculums in your schools and students that are aligning to those curriculums, that allows us to then focus on how do we develop employment opportunities and to bring the potential to customers, whether they be federal or state, and to say, we have a population that can service this requirement, and to develop pilot programs and then longer term programs that allow that curriculum to lead to adult employment. Next slide, please. So just as a summary slide here, we mentioned the number of agencies in the network. There's about 650. And so Chimes is one of the larger agencies, but you have smaller agencies that may have only one contract. They may be doing some local work. So it runs a very wide spectrum of companies there. And that's why you have that number. The National Institute of Industries of the Blind have about another 100 agencies that are doing that work. And then roughly 480. So that's over 1,000 businesses across the country that are providing support for individuals with disabilities. And again, to target, where are they, where am I? In the bottom here, we have a couple of links to the fact sheets. And on the AbilityOne site, there is a map. There's a registry of all the different agencies across the country that are providing support. And you know, we wanted to just point that out, that it's available. And then we're going to be making it an easier look up and posting that. So again, to help to facilitate that conversation. The agencies, again, 75,000 individuals potentially in the AbilityOne network, 6,000 in the Industries for the Blind, and another 22,000 in state use. So when someone, you know, might say, hey, we should do away with these programs, we would argue, no, don't do that at all, because we're supporting 100,000 people here. And not only 100,000 people, we're supporting their communities, their families. This is very real. These are not, these jobs are full wages and with benefits. So these are jobs in the community that individuals are able to perform. And when you try to get an idea of, when you see the companies, the number of individuals, this is roughly a $4 billion or plus program for the federal and state sales. So there's a lot of money being flowed into this, a lot of purchases being made and fulfilled by individuals with disabilities. And in particular, as we went through COVID here, a lot of the individuals, they were on the front line. They were coming to work every day. So when you ask about their ability to be able to perform in a crisis, they demonstrated that. So again, the merit of the programs and providing opportunities and the dedication of the individuals in the programs to come to work and to continue to work in a crisis was just outstanding. So again, why are these programs meaningful? They're providing an opportunity for service, both for us to serve the population, but also for the population to be of service and to serve in their communities, which they recognize and they see as a significant value as an employee. Next slide, please. So you have a couple of maps here to give you some idea of the dispersion. And generally, if you have a federal installation, there could be an AbilityOne contract in conjunction with that installation doing some work. If you have an Army base, in larger cities, you obviously have a little bit greater density. And the same thing with the National Industries of the Blind. But these programs are across the country. The next slide, please. This is also a registry of the state use. So between the federal programs and the state use, you have a lot of employment, but you'll also notice on the state use, there are states that are not listed here. So again, there's opportunities to work with the state agencies that are supporting disability, that to recognize and say, hey, why are we not utilizing procurement priorities in our state to be able to support our individuals? So it's it can be a very collaborative conversation to develop things. And again, new ideas, innovation, they can be brought in and make a proposal to the government office that this is how people with disabilities can support the mission of the office. Next slide, please. And just an array of the current portfolio. It has historically been more hands-on. But as I say that, we're also now working on establishing a new contract that will be doing knowledge-based skills. It will be working with the Coast Guard to input information, supply chain information into their supply systems, and to include the cataloging and maintenance of systems that they have that are fielded across the Coast Guard. And all of these positions are higher wage positions in the roughly $70,000 a year job range, and enable the individuals to, again, learn and move forward into an engineering skill set that is utilized across large system development, both in federal industries and in any industry where you're trying to figure out how do you supply and maintain systems that you work with. So, but it's a groundbreaking opportunity here, because the individuals, when you talk about integrated into their workspace, we may have 13, 14 individuals on the contract, but they're all going to be dispersed among different offices in the business centers. So some would be doing transportation, some would be doing maintenance. So again, it's a real demonstration of the higher level capacity that can be brought and align education to employment for this type of work site, and it has a very definite career ladder to it. Next slide, please. And again, just our profile in closing, we operate primarily in the Mid-Atlantic region, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on the north to Fort Bragg, North Carolina on the southern boundary, but our center of mass is in the Baltimore, Washington metro area. And again, we have a classical footprint of primarily custodial, grounds maintenance. We do facility engineering, and that's where you do HVAC and heating, electrical, and things of that nature. And we're looking to incorporate that and align with the union apprenticeship programs, again, to try to foster that those skills, development of those skills. Not only are we having the employment footprint, but also Chimes as a corporation is integrated into many of these neighborhoods as well. So while we're performing work at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, Chimes also has an office providing behavioral supports and support to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in Delaware. So again, we're in some places we're a standalone doing work. In others, we're integrated into the neighborhood, especially here in Baltimore, another example. And we have roughly around 1,300 individuals in the company, roughly 800 to 900, depending on where we are in a year, that are individuals with disabilities. And we look at, not only are we supporting those individuals directly with employment, but via the employment programs and the reach of the employment programs, we're supporting a much larger footprint, both locally via Chimes and then across the nation, when you think of that network of 650 employers and even more at the state level. And one of the things that we find ourselves in a role of on a regular basis is advocacy. As issues are evolving, that we need to take a position to protect the opportunities for our employees, we will step in and fill that role, as well as including, and the pictures I have there are some of the individuals who have worked with us as self-advocates. And some of the pictures there are meeting with senators and representatives on Capitol Hill when they were trying to understand what was happening during federal shutdowns or what was happening with COVID. And they came out and they held town halls and met with our employees to better understand how their lives were being impacted so that they could work with us to support them. Next slide, please. And again, that's the end of my part. And I revert back to the summary slide, and Terry covered this, but Tyrone, who is one of our self-advocates and participated in Capitol Hill, multiple Capitol Hill events, he's a wonderful gentleman and is very good representative for his program and how it's helped him and his life, his family, and for his coworkers. So that's the nature of the program, is to provide those opportunities and to grow it so that we can continue to do that and to foster conversation, because we also are trying to interact with local business so that it's not just on federal and state contracts that individuals are employed, but also then to talk to the community. And what does it really take? So we have a couple of programs right now where we're working with the school systems to try to integrate into our federal sites, because we have customers who are supportive, but also to pattern that so that we can go out and have a greater conversation with the local business community for further advancement and development of employment opportunities in their job sites, and to not just be looking at the most highly functional, but also then to look at how can we design systems to support people who have higher level, more severe disability, but enable them to achieve the same outcomes in a work environment. So it's a collaborative conversation, and we recognize that it's growing and look forward to continuing it. But that completes my part, and thank you very much. And Brian, I guess we're moving on to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. One of the questions that came in was, can you talk a little bit about how within Chimes environment or other AbilityOne programs, can people be promoted internally? Are there skills that are mastered, and is there ability to move up within the organization?
Yes, there are. And so in most of the contracts, you have the kind of the line workers, and then you have management positions. And Tyrone is one example of that. He started as a custodian. He moved up to be the recycling manager, and then now he's a supervisor. So there are on every contract, there's an opportunity. Now, obviously, if something's a very small contract, it's more limited. But we also then look at promoting from within. So if we have strong individuals on one contract who want to be promoted, and we have a supervisor position come open, and we can go laterally and continue to allow people to have career progression. We've also worked with one of the customers when we couldn't source a requirement via recruiting. We talked to our workforce and were able to train an individual to be able to change a job code from being a custodian to being a general maintenance worker. And then that individual was now working with a different agency and providing day-to-day general maintenance support to the customer. So there's all different ways to work at it. And we try to find that. And that's why we're excited about the Coast Guard jobs, because they really do have a career ladder into an engineering discipline that is well seated in industry. And it's very different from what we've historically done. The same thing with the trades, to be able to work and design programs via apprenticeship programs that allow individuals to have a real broad spectrum of opportunity.
Excellent. And to piggyback on that question, what about moving on from the AbilityOne programs? Is there employment outside of the programs?
There is currently employment outside the program. So we have turnover like any other industry, and individuals will come work with us. And again, as I mentioned, we see work is the treatment, and they learn skills. They develop their employment skills to where they recognize there are better jobs in the community, and we foster that to help them to learn skills, master skills, and then assist them with the desire to move on and look for other opportunities. Some of our jobs are cleared. That means they have a security clearance from the federal government. So it's very interesting where you have an individual that'll join us. They start work, they get a security clearance, and the security clearance is a real qualifying badge there. And as soon as they have that, they are very marketable, and they'll move on to other agencies in the community, other businesses, and to where they can leverage that clearance for higher salaries. So we've seen many opportunities where individuals come in and start, and they learn and they move on, and just as you would in any other industry. So there's transition and career growth.
And so we talked a little bit about the jobs and then at post jobs. What about internships? Are there internships available for people that are currently in school?
And that's where we're working right now. So we've reached out to the school systems that are in the neighborhoods that are close to our job sites with that very question. And so if we have a vacancy and you have a student, what is it that prevents us from filling our vacancy with your student? And then to, one, start the dialogue with the school. And then also, if we can align curriculum, and that you have the individuals that have been kind of trained via the school and their classwork to be able to align with that job site, then to go to the customer jointly and to have that conversation. Because if we have a vacancy, we can fill it with a full-time or a part-time and the agency, but we need to incorporate them so they understand the dynamic here that we are going to be working with students. And right now we have 2 pilot programs, one in 2 different counties in Maryland that we're looking to do that. And again, as you look for agencies that are in your neighborhoods, we all have positions. We've all had shortages in staffing as a result of COVID. So it's really aligning the student population and their desires and the job population. And one other thing that you notice, and when you noticed our map, so we may be located in Baltimore, but that doesn't mean all of our jobs are in Baltimore. And there's many of us that the headquarters may be in a certain town, but they have a much broader footprint for employment. So when you go to their career page, if you're in an area, they may be located in Maryland, but they may have jobs in 6 different states. So look at the career pages and you'll be able to determine where the positions actually are. And it may be very different location from where the headquarters of the organization is sitting.
Excellent. Another question that came in is related to the disability, and on the AbilityOne program, is there specific disabilities that are included or excluded? The question asked specifically about autism.
Each individual, if you're going to be qualified as disabled, needs to provide medical documentation that basically documents the disability. So there's nothing that's precluded. It needs to be something that can be accommodated at the work site. And that's part of the program, is to try to align individuals. So if they desire employment in Baltimore, what are the jobs in Baltimore that align with their capabilities? And then we'll work also with community service providers who may provide job coaches. So under my business line, we don't have job coaches, but when we're working with a community service provider and that the individual is being supported by that agency, they provide the job coach. So the individual comes to work as an employee. The job coach comes from the supporting agency to assist in their employment skill development. So it's a collaboration there to achieve but it would all be, looking at the individual and looking at the jobs and trying to find that right accommodation and fit. Excellent.
Terry, this question is for you. As we talk through the different areas, what would you say the next steps would be for, after this session for students and individuals?
I suspect, one of our goals was for awareness that this program exists. Having sat through IEP meetings, going through the transitioning process, it was simply never a consideration that somebody would say, well, do you think your kid would like to get a part-time job? So the awareness that this program exists. Next steps in terms of what we at Chimes will be doing And we probably will have some invited guests. Dr. Peter Gerhard, who's an expert in transitioning individuals with autism from education into life after education. Congressman Chris Smith will be invited. He's the chairperson of the Congressional Autism Committee. Deborah Phelps, those of you who follow the Olympics, you've seen her son swim, is also a lifetime educator and advocate for the disabled. So, we're going to continue a series of webinars to provide people with the resources to learn more about the program. I'll probably speak at some point about how do you deal with challenging behaviors for kids who are coming out of education and getting them ready for work. So there's a series. I think our next webinar is expected to be in about 6 weeks. And then we'll probably have what's being labeled a fly-in conference for about 3 hours in May. So I hope that answers your question, Brian.
Excellent. Thank you, Terry. A couple things that have been asked is related to the presentation. We will be sending that out in PDF form so that you'll be able to use the resources that were put together by Jerry and Terry for you guys today as well. And then I think that is it in terms of questions this afternoon. Terry, I don't know if you want to send us off this afternoon.
Well, thank you for being the administrator today, Brian. Brian is our Chief Information Officer, wears a lot of hats, but he never lets us down on tech. So thank you all for joining us. I think we had a total of 250 plus registrations, and hopefully we begin to alert the community of the availability of this as an option. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.